So you know how the French were talking about possibly deploying their troops inside Ukraine? Well, it seems like, even if it's just being floated for strategic ambiguity, the Canadians are starting to float as well. The Canadian Minister of National Defense, Bill Blair, said that they're open, not that they would, not that they wouldn't, just that they also have some strategic ambiguity about them deploying Canadian soldiers, Canadian forces to Ukraine in order to conduct training operations. So this would not be Canadian soldiers storming like trenches in Donetsk. This would not be, Canadian soldiers, doing some special ops. This would just be Canadian soldiers engaging in training operations. But as the Ukrainians are looking at mobilizing somewhere between like 300,000 to 509,000, if you look at what the generals have asked for hundreds of thousands and thousands and thousands of men in order to fight the Russians, and they're trying to figure out how many people they want to mobilize. If they have other soldiers like this from other nations, already trained soldiers who know how to train others, then that can free up some of their training personnel to train other soldiers. They can help train and get more personnel mobilized, and that means they're supplementing the Ukrainian army in some form. So some staff that would have been training will instead be doing something else and helping in some other capacity, as the manpower shortage is hurting the Ukrainians. So this is one way to help the manpower shortage directly by training soldiers and supplementing their forces. This is on top of the French getting a little bit more clear about what they meant when it came to their strategic ambiguity, about what they might be willing to do if they deployed their soldiers to Ukraine. This is the French Prime Minister. He is, I believe, their first gay prime minister as well. He's quite young for the position. He gave some details as to what that deployment would look like as he was facing down with Marine Le Pen and other legislators in France who were saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe you would say send troops, or the strategic ambiguity. We haven't built a consensus around this. Why would you go out and say something like that? He talked a lot about this. This is a French article, so you're probably not going to find it in English. It's from the Public Senate. If you wanted to find it, you have to translate it. So this is Google translated, and we'll admit to that. But he still makes it very clear what they would mean by deploying troops to Ukraine. When we talk about French soldiers, we can absolutely talk about soldiers carrying out training. So the same things that the Canadians are talking about, training soldiers, helping try to get soldiers trained so they can go out there. Introductory training. So there are Ukrainians that can do a lot of the more expertise training. This is not an issue of like, oh, the Ukrainians need to learn from the brilliant Canadians. This is an issue that they have a lot of people who don't have any military experience who are going to need to be trained. Ground to air defense, or defense of certain number of borders. So ground to air defense, this means missiles coming to hit Kiev, Shahed drones, whether made in Iran or contracted to be made in Russia. These getting fired at major cities like Kiev could be intercepted under the scenario of French deployment by French soldiers working on anti-aircraft systems. So French soldiers would be intercepting Russian bombs, Russian missiles, Russian drones, you get the idea, and a certain number of defense on a certain number of borders. Now, I saw some people freaking out about this, just a few, saying, oh, this could be used to put them on the front. No, this most likely means, if I'm being blunt, just like covering the border with Belarus. If you look at a map of Ukraine, the areas that cover Belarus used to be full of Russian soldiers. That's how they invaded Kiev. But since then, they have lessened the amount of soldiers they have in this area. And recently, it was announced that another 13,000 Russian soldiers were taken out from this area, and they've been moved somewhere else. Most likely, in my opinion, redeployed to the east to continue the Russian offensives as they try to take advantage of the ammo shortage and the personnel shortage. It's because they're taking high losses to take this territory. But if they can keep funneling troops in there, then hypothetically, as long as the Ukrainians can't stabilize the front, they could keep slowly crawling forward, taking villages. I know that Avdiivka's fallen, but also 2 villages next to Avdiivka. And we're talking about this on the channel recently. One second. Let's see if we can find Avdiivka on the front here. It was right around here. Yeah, right here. We were talking about these villages also getting pushed, with the Russians partially entering Olivka. They haven't lost it yet, and they also haven't lost this village down here. But if they can keep funneling troops in, they can push, push, push. And so the Ukrainians need personnel elsewhere. And so if the French took care of border patrol duties with the border of Belarus, a nation that isn't directly fighting the Ukrainians anyway, even if they've allowed themselves to be used as a launching pad to attack Ukraine, then the Ukrainians could free up those border guards and send them elsewhere, either to do checkpoint duty throughout the country, because there's a lot of checkpoints in the country that are staffed and need to be staffed, or to be retrained so they can try to hold the front, or, you know, do some type of transportation duty, something else. Further help supplement Ukrainian manpower. I gotta say, them working air defense is more than I would have expected him to say the French might do. But I do think that if you want to do this type of intervention, this is about how you would do it. This would be as far as I would expect the West would be willing to go, because they do not want Western soldiers fighting Russian soldiers on the front. And in this scenario, it does give the Russians, because if they put them on the front, like whether they like it or not, American soldiers, French soldiers, they're gonna die. But by putting them in areas like along the border with Belarus, or putting them in air defense, like mobile units throughout central Ukraine, while there's still a chance that they could get killed by a drone hitting some, you know, staff post or hitting some air defense unit, the odds of them dying are lower. And the odds of a direct military confrontation with Russian soldiers are much lower as well. And so this might be a way for the French and the Canadians and possibly other European powers. I imagine the Estonians, Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Poles are probably considering this very heartily right now as well, of supplementing the Ukrainian manpower problem, both with training, both with air defense, and when it comes to just like border patrol, and allowing them to move either experienced air defense people closer to the front so they can shoot down a lot of Russian jets. The Russians have lost, reportedly, it depends on how much data you believe from the Ukrainians. Some of it has evidence, some of it doesn't. But according to the Ukrainians, 13 jets in the last like 11 days, which of course, a few of those might be off, but we have a lot of photographic evidence for a lot of those. And that's because the Russians are using a ton of glide bombs, pushing the front. So if you could take experienced anti-aircraft crews from these parts of the country, and the French presumably might send those soldiers in with their air defense systems, then those soldiers could be doing hard work on those planes, either dropping glide bombs near the front or just being near the front for any other purpose, especially if they keep losing A-50 aircraft and that hurts their intelligence. But this is just ways that the Europeans could supplement the Ukrainian manpower problem and help them as they're looking at mobilization, which the Zelensky government at least believes is politically difficult. So I don't think this is going to be happening anytime soon. We're talking about potential things that is being floated by the French and the Canadians, and as of right now can just be interpreted as strategic ambiguity. There has been no legislation introduced in Canada to send troops over. The government has not taken any position to send troops over, and the same thing is true of the French. But the French is, I think, most clearly highlighting what they would want to do if they did do it. And I think the French are the ones that are at least being, I don't want to say the edgiest about this, but are probing the most on this. And hitting the strategic ambiguity on a messaging point the hardest. So whether or not they end up delivering on this, or this is just a way to make a point to the Russians that they will not be allowed to pass a certain point, whether that is the Dnieper River or wherever the French could draw some red line before they deploy troops, or if they might do this depending on how, you know, the Russians go forward with the war, or if the Ukrainians request manpower assistance, I don't know. As of right now, all we know is that now the French and the Canadians are floating strategic ambiguity when it comes to troop deployments to Ukraine, which is a significant change, even if the Germans are still shaking their head furiously at the proposal. Of all the countries, France and Canada surprised me. I know, right? I figured the Polish would be the first to make this kind of move. Honestly, I thought it might be the British, because the British, you know, they helped with being the first to send long range munitions. They were one of the first to send no, they were the first to send big tanks, which they thought would be too escalatory. It seems to be bipartisan consensus to support Ukraine. They're trying to go in their own kind of independent path, you know, kind of weirdly separate from Europe, but but also as it was kind of if they do that, they're going to basically just become America's little brother. So I thought they would, they might do it, but I didn't think that there was a political consensus to it, and there isn't a political consensus to it. But I didn't think that there was enough of I didn't think the political environment existed for them to suggest this. And so the fact that two countries have now suggested it openly suggests not only a shift of, I think, the political consensus in the capitals and the governments, but that they think that the populations would at least be willing to bear the idea, if not the action. But I don't know if that's true in France. Maybe Canada, but I don't know about France. And, all of this posturing is good, but at the end of the day, it's just still strategic ambiguity and could end up having very little impact on the front at all, if there's no hard power backing up French commit. Like if the French just say, oh, maybe we'll deploy troops, but then they lean back on not sending anything, the Russians are going to see a lot of words, not a lot of actions. So my main advice to the French would be, if they want this strategic ambiguity to have an impact and it's not just a bunch of fluff, then they're going to have to make the threat credible. And to make the threat credible, they need to show they're dedicated to Ukraine. And they're doing that in some ways through bilateral security agreements and $3 billion in funding for this year, but they're still towards the bottom of the funding spectrum for Ukraine. I think they should, on a bilateral basis, even if they say they still support a significant amount through EU institutions, on a bilateral basis, they need to send more support to Ukraine, along with rhetoric like this. So the Russians take notice and don't just think, this is rhetoric, if that's the effect they want to have.